Hi, everybody. So, on today's program, we have a very special guest by the name of Dinesh D'Souza. He is an author, filmmaker, and host of Dinesh D'Souza podcast. Thank you so much, Dinesh, for being on the show.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So you just came out with a large series, 5 videos, framing the founding fathers and different ways in which they were pivotal to the American experience and our founding. Now, your first video in that playlist is about Hamilton. So what I want to ask you in regard to this is that right now in American society, the left particularly is really entrenched in this idea of systemic racism and systemic oppression. And I used to be on the left. And with that, I was sort of sold the narrative that there are all these barriers set in place for me to be successful and prosperous in this country. Now, you challenged that with the history of what Hamilton did for America and said that his vision was to have as many people as possible be as prosperous as possible in America. So how do you respond to the people on the left who say that that's not the case?
Well, for Hamilton, the key question to realize is that wealth is not distributed, it is created. You know, we often hear the term redistribution. And when people say redistribution, they imply like there has been some original distribution, like someone came along and handed out the cookies, and now they're looking around and going, wow, that's an unjust distribution. We need to redistribute. Hamilton's idea is that human beings find themselves in nature. And in nature, you have abundance, but the abundance is concealed. And so, for example, think of it this way. There's a table concealed in a tree, but someone's got to cut down the wood and make it into a table. And some of nature is mysterious. You have to figure out how nature works. And that's how you get technology. You get new things that didn't exist before. So the real value that human beings bring to this is their own ingenuity, their creativity, and their hard work. That's the role of the so-called entrepreneur. So for Hamilton, wealth is created in this way, and none of us is blocked from doing it. All you have to do is think about what you can do with nature and also what people want, because after all, capitalism works on supply and demand. So for Hamilton, ultimately, we are all consumers, but we are also creators.
Amazing. But it seems as though the majority of this country, at least now with what we're feeling in regard to the government, doesn't seem to feel that way. Now, in your video on Madison, you talk about the dangers of the majority and how he warned against the tyranny of the majority. But now we hear the narrative that, well, if the majority of people believe in something, then it must be true and it must be right and it must be just. And we should defend the majority as much as possible. Why did Madison sort of defend against that idea, and why is it dangerous?
Madison understood that there's tyranny in two ways. One is the tyranny of the one or the few, and the other is the tyranny of the many. It's very important to realize that there's really no fundamental distinction between these two forms of tyranny. Think of it this way. If I'm walking to school and I've got some marbles in my pocket, and one guy jumps me and grabs my marbles, that's tyrannical. This is someone taking something from me by force. But let's say I've fallen among a gang of 10 guys, and they take a vote, and they decide that by, let's say, a vote of 7-3, that they really want my marbles. And so the 7 of them jump on me and take my marbles against my will. Or they pass a law that confiscates my marbles and turns it over to them. So for Madison, what's the difference between these two cases? Well, in principle, there's none. In both cases, somebody is being deprived of their legitimate possession, either by the force applied by the one or the force applied by the many. So this is not to say that Madison is against majority rule. Madison realizes that majority rule is sort of the least bad option. Why? Because the only alternative is minority rule. So majority rule is kind of the best we got. But in order to be legitimate, it is rule that has to be confined within certain parameters. Like the majority can do X, Y, and Z, but it can't do A, B, and C. So when the majority oversteps its bounds, that's when it's being tyrannical.
And can you explain how in our system of government we are meant to keep the minority voices alive and keep them present in our society?
So for Madison, that is done in two ways. The first way is through a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is rights asserted against the majority. In fact, rights asserted, Madison's not hesitant to say, against the people. So you have a right to speak. It doesn't matter if 99% of people don't agree with you. They don't have the right to shut you up. You have that right against the majority. And so if you look at all the provisions of the Bill of Rights, those are asserted against majority rule. But apart from the Bill of Rights, Madison believed that the architecture of the founding, separation of powers, checks and balances, the independent judiciary, these are all means to, you might say, block and tackle untrammeled majority rule.
Now, let's move on to Jefferson. And I have a feeling this is the video that you will probably get the most heat for, because you talk about what some might call the elephant in the room, although I don't think conservatives stray from this subject. You talk about slavery. Now, the left views slavery as so pivotal to the founding of America that now they've launched the 1619 Project, which asserts that the founding of this country truly happened in 1619 when the first slave ships landed in America. What is your response to that? And is Jefferson truly the big racist, white supremacist slave owner that he has been painted as?
Well, let's start with the line that Jefferson wrote in his so-called summary view, which came a little before the Declaration of Independence and reflected Jefferson's original thinking on the subject. Jefferson is attacking the crown, the King of England, for imposing slavery in America. Let's remember that between 1619 and the founding is 150 years. And Jefferson goes, we never opted for slavery. You, the British, brought it here and shoved it down our throats. And then Jefferson says the abolition of slavery, the desire to end slavery, is the shared desire of all the colonies. I mean, it's remarkable. Jefferson is saying, even as a slave owner, that the southern territories and colonies, no less than the northern, don't want slavery either. So, if you want to grapple with Jefferson, you have to make sense of why Jefferson would do this. You can't just say, well, Jefferson was so dumb that he didn't realize that, on the one hand he had slaves, on the other hand he's saying these things. Jefferson, more than you and I, realized the contradiction between what he was saying and what he was doing. But he wanted to live in a better America than the one he inherited, in his view, from the British.
So how do you think that narrative got lost? Because we know this to be true. We know that they had a plan of abolishing slavery. How have we lost that narrative in our education system?
Because when we look at the Declaration of Independence, we focus on the first part and not on the second part. So the first part is created equal. All men are created equal. Jefferson knew that. But Jefferson also knew what comes at the end of that sentence that goes missed. It's governments are instituted by the consent of the governed. Right? Now, here's the point, and here's the problem, and this is the American problem of the founding, which is this. What if you live in a society where the governed, the people themselves, have not given consent to total abolition? They haven't signed on to it. Now what? Now you can say, well, that's okay. We abolished slavery anyway. Well, how? You do it by running over the consent of the governed. In other words, you end democracy before it even begins. So Jefferson realized that what you have is a tension between the beginning and the end of the Declaration of Independence. And ultimately, slavery can only be ended when the consent of the governed comes into harmony with created equal. Now, that did not happen until the Civil War. It didn't happen until 2 generations after Jefferson. So Jefferson was trying to figure out, how do we create a system in which we can be true not only to the principle of equality, but also to the principle of democracy?
Yeah, that's a very important point, is that all the founding fathers were trying to be true to that principle of equality. They were trying to be virtuous. Now, in your video on John Adams, you focus a lot on his sentiment of being virtuous. And some might say that the left and John Adams sort of have this in common. They view virtue as something being very, very important. But the left nowadays views virtue as somehow being synonymous with being compliant and being empathetic towards people in an extreme way, something they've coined as radical empathy. How is the left's view of virtue and John Adams' view of virtue different?
John Adams' view of virtue is neither the view that you sometimes hear on the right of virtue as identified, you could almost call it with female chastity. So in other words, the virtue of abstinence, the virtue of pro-life. We think of virtue kind of in that family of issues as almost a feminine virtue. But for Adams, virtue was actually a masculine idea. And by masculine, I don't mean it's confined to men. What I mean is he's talking about civic virtue. He's talking about, for example, being a responsible citizen. He's talking about how do you develop an attachment to things larger than yourself. How do you develop an attachment to family, to community, let's say to the Little Leagues and the Boy Scouts? How do you develop an attachment to your country that's going to make you care about the larger good, the public good, and not just your own good? So virtue is defined that way. But this is an energetic virtue that involves personal striving. It's not the kind of posturing that the left is all. I mean, in the left, what you have is you have some guy like Bill Clinton, who's essentially, in personal terms, absolutely disgusting. But he goes, well, yeah, but I'm in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, Or you even have a LeBron James who's like makes $70 million a year. But he goes, I'm oppressed compared to a white, taxi driver. Really? So what you have is virtue has taken on a twisted and bogus quality on the left. It's not the genuine virtue that Adams cared about.
So how do you think we reinvigorate that idea of John Adams' virtue in America, because it's seemingly lost on a large portion of our citizens?
It's hard to get it back because in the original form, you have a civic attachment to people who are like yourself. In other words, it's difficult to develop the civic attachment to strangers. And so the only way to do that is when you begin to feel that those strangers are now your fellow citizens. So the problem with this kind of fractured, divided America we have is that we look at the left and we go, your America isn't even our America. So why would we be willing to die for your America? No more than you'd be willing to die for ours. And so when you have this breakdown, the left in a way doesn't know what it's doing. What it's doing is it's creating an America in which the bonds of common citizenship are being very seriously frayed. And it's going to cause people right and left to kind of turn in on themselves and only promote their own group.
You're absolutely right. And when we speak about civic attachment to strangers, it reminds me of our next father, and that is Benjamin Franklin, the great diplomat, the author, the publisher, the inventor. Now, he's done so many things. Some may even call him a master of all trades. But what do you think was Ben Franklin's most important contribution to the American governance and American society?
Well, Ben Franklin was, a Renaissance man. Now, he wasn't the only Renaissance man. Thomas Jefferson was the Renaissance man. Jefferson was an inventor, a diplomat, a writer. He had this kind of an anthropologist. But Franklin was a philanthropist. He was a printer. He was an entrepreneur. He was a diplomat. He was also this kind of, he did scientific experiments in electricity. So he's this varied guy. But I would argue that his greatest invention is himself. So to put it differently, it's self-invention. And if you think about it, this is really a very core American idea. The notion that your own life is a script in which you are the author. You won't find that in any other country. Even if you go to Europe, the idea is, well, you're a Frenchman. You're not supposed to be all that different from other Frenchmen. Yeah, you have your own name and so on, but you got to, eat croissants and speak the French language and appreciate but the idea that your own life is distinctively yours and you're in the driver's seat of it. Franklin not only believed that, he lived that. And so he becomes in a way, the embodiment of the self-made man. Now, later, there are other self-made men in American history. For example, Frederick Douglass, who actually went around the country giving speeches called the self-made man. Frederick Douglass was himself a self-made man. Runaway slave. He becomes a diplomat. He becomes a famous writer and speaker. So he's in the Franklin tradition. But the mold, the original self-made man, in my view, was in fact Benjamin Franklin.
Well, amazing. Dinesh, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. As everybody watching, if you want to hear more about what he's saying about these founding fathers, you can go to his series on PragerU.com called Making America. I encourage you to watch the entire playlist. There is such a large wealth of knowledge available in those videos. And you should also support Dinesh by, 1, buying his books, and 2, listening to his podcast, the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. Now, Dinesh, I want to end on one thing. So let's assume that nobody sees these videos. What is one thing you want everybody to leave with from the founding fathers that they should remember and carry with them through their daily lives?
Well, the American founders wanted to create a new kind of society. And when we think about the American Revolution, it's really the only successful revolution in world history. There have been many other revolutions, notably the French Revolution, but the French Revolution ended in what's called the Terror, when ultimately Napoleon comes in as the emperor. That's the end of the French Revolution. The Russian Revolution, a disaster. Mao's Cultural Revolution, a disaster, and many other smaller disasters. So the American Revolution has now endured for 200 years, but it seems to me its ultimate success remains an open question. So at a time when we're wondering, like, do those old principles that go back to 1789, do they still apply today? We're not an agricultural society. We have all this technology. We have a different society today. What do the founders have to say to us? And my answer in these videos, and I have to condense them because I've got 5 videos, but I think if you watch all 5, you actually get a comprehensive picture of the sort of philosophical statesmanship that goes into the founding, the architecture of the founding, and you can see how that vision, even though dimmed, should not be lost because it has a lot to say to us today.
Don't let it be lost, ladies and gentlemen. Dinesh, thank you so much for being on Will and Amala Live. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.